So, a little while back, I finished Cerulean Crescent, a fan-made Fire Emblem game made by Rivian. It's fantastic, and I'd recommend anyone try it. And today I'm going to explain why I like it, so you can tell if you would like it too. I already made a video like this on Cerulean Crescent, where I talked about my first impressions, but that one is not really required watching for this one. In fact, since I have a more complete understanding of the game now, I actually changed my mind a bit on how I want to review this hack. Let's talk about gameplay first. Cerulean Crescent is a game where the player has a ton of powerful tools to work with. Every single unit in this game is way stronger than your average unit in Fire Emblem. For example, the main character Ellery has a personal skill that gives all adjacent units an extra turn if she kills an enemy. She's accompanied by a special dancer, Oriana, who not only revitalizes an ally when she dances, but also herself. And both of these units are also really good at fighting. Both of them join right at the start, and you get a neat tutorial that shows off both of their capabilities, as well as those of several others. Because of this, I think both the game, as well as my previous review, give off the impression that Cerulean Crescent is a puzzle game, where the maps expect you to always make maximum use of your powerful tools to win. But nothing could be further from the truth. Cerulean Crescent maps would be kind of difficult if you didn't use all these extremely powerful abilities. I would say they would probably be about as hard as FE6 hard mode, but because you have all these tools at your disposal and you get so many of them, the game is a lot easier. I think I initially felt like the game was difficult because for the early game I was still getting used to the character's abilities, but the first units you recruit are probably the most complicated ones, and once you're accustomed to them, the rest are a lot easier to grasp. Once you understand what each of your units can do, it is a lot easier to make your moves intuitively and just overwhelm the enemies with sheer player phase power. You can still die if you really don't pay attention because the enemies are not weak, but as long as you're sort of making smart moves, the game is not expecting you to make optimal moves every turn. Not at all. Also, if you do mess up and one of your character dies, you can start from the beginning of your last turn, so you don't have to reset the entire chapter if you don't want to. That makes it a lot easier as well. The game absolutely showers you in units with strong personal weapons and personal skills. A fair amount of them give you extra turns to work with. There's a villager unit with Gale Force. There's an archer with a bow that grants an extra turn at the cost of some of her movement for that turn. There is a tactician that simply always gets 2 turns to do whatever she wants. There's a green chicken that summons another chicken, and then when that second chicken performs an action, it vanishes, and that grants the first chicken another turn. And you could do that multiple times. As long as you're using these abilities for some value, you can expect to come out on top. Speaking of extra turns, one of my favorite features in this game are ley lines. They are these weird looking tiles on the map that look like small little blue campfires. When a unit uses a ley line, they are fully healed, gain an extra turn, and plus 10 attack. This can be an emergency recovery option, or a way to get really aggressive, or both. Ley lines are a part of what keeps the map design of Cerulean Crescent so tight and high tempo. There is rarely a dull moment, and you're never stuck just moving a low move unit across a large map to get somewhere, or waiting for your units to collect a treasure chest before you can finally seize. Another element of clever map design are stairways and tunnels, which connect different portions of the map with each other like teleporters. This allows units to go to a corner somewhere to perform a task and then quickly go elsewhere to reinforce a different area. One of the worst feelings in Fire Emblem, I think, is having to send a unit to a remote place, knowing they probably will not be able to get back into the action for the rest of the map. This almost never happens in Cerulean Crescent, since usually the larger the maps, the more of these teleporters there are. Now, ley lines and stairways wouldn't mean much if the Cerulean maps had nothing else going on, they'd just be like Revelation maps, but they always do. There are often chests to open, as well as loot crates, not the predatory kind, which are basically chests you have to attack and kill to get the contents off. Almost every map has multiple directions to go and reasons to split up your units, sometimes even forcing you to. There are some maps with time limits and anti-turtling mechanics, although I personally found that these are very easy to outspeed. In fact, the game has a special mechanic that prohibits you from gaining experience past, I believe, turn 13 to disincentivize tactics like boss abuse, but this has literally never been a concern for me. I forgot it was a thing by like chapter 5. I do want to go on a quick tangent here about anti-turtling incentives and map design. A while back on Reddit, I read a criticism on another fan game, Vision Quest. The person was, politely I should add, voicing their discontent with the hack, saying they didn't like how every map was forcing you to go fast with reinforcements from your starting position. I think usually when Fire Emblem hackers and players are discussing map designs, these types of reinforcements and other anti-turtling incentives are brought up as a good thing, but I think there can be too much of a good thing. First of all, because if every map has this type of design, it gets repetitive. But second, it is an extra bit of difficulty that not every player is going to be able to handle or even wants to handle. I do think ROM hackers in a vacuum can get away with a higher default difficulty because very few, if any, people are going to play their games before one, let alone multiple mainline Fire Emblem games. A ROM hack can be a little harder. It doesn't have to start at literal Lin mode level tutorials to teach someone how to play. But difficulty is a slider, a spectrum, and you can push it too far if you over-rely on these kind of methods. Some people enjoy taking their time on a map, even if to other players it seems very boring to bait and switch their way through, and you do take away that option by over-relying on anti-turtling incentives. I don't know how large this crowd is compared to the amount of people that get more enjoyment out of maps that do have these reinforcements, but what I want to get across is that using this trick that is often regarded as a good thing, especially overusing this trick, might not always be good. That said, I'm happy to report that Cerulean Crescent strikes a good balance here in my opinion. There are often timed incentives, be it the classic strong enemies coming from the starting points, or a hard turn limit, or some other thing, but the player has so many tools to go fast that I think for the vast majority of people giving this a go, it really is not a problem to get literally every main and side objectives, as long as they know what to do. That latter point can be a bit of a problem sometimes, but a very small one. Overall, I think they're well done, so before I get into what the problem is here, I need to explain a little bit about explorations and quests. This game features explorations in between some battles where the main character can walk around freely to visit shops and talk to other characters. They are a great bit of breathing room between the hectic battles and I enjoy them very much, especially when it comes to the writing, which I will get into later. And when you talk to the NPCs, sometimes they will offer you a quest. Do this thing for me and I'll give you gold or items or I'll do you some other favor. And this thing they want done is something during gameplay. It can be collecting an item, visiting a certain house or a village or a cemetery, talking to a person, and so on. It's win-win-win. It adds side objectives to the maps, it adds depth to the world building or the characters, and it integrates the gameplay with the story. It's super well done. But it does, however, add to the amount of things that you have to remember to do. Imagine you go into an exploration and the first thing you do is talk to some fella who wants you to do something in a place you've never heard of, say Galunzar or something. And then you talk to 50 other people who talk about their own problems and their relationships, and then you go into a set of 2 maps, one of which has that specific thing that the first NPC talked about. And sometimes it isn't quite so specific that you will immediately remember. Fortunately, there is a feature that helps with this, which is the guide window. In there you can see all the quests that you have to do, as well as refer back to other people, places, and lore that you want to refresh your memory on. This is helpful, but I still found myself forgetting to do quest things with chat needing to remind me. It could be a me problem. I played this game in 3 to 4 hour sessions twice a week, reading out all the text, and so maybe this is not an issue the average player has, but I just thought I would warn you to take extra care to check on these quests at least once every chapter, because you get some good stuff from them. The last bit of gameplay related praise I want to give Cerulean Crescent is that I'm a big fan of how it handles boss battles. Fire Emblem usually isn't very good at these. Big boss fights in the main series tend to be either trivial or cheap with very little room for in between. It's kind of in the nature of a boss fight to be contradictory with Fire Emblem's mechanics. A single strong enemy up against many of your units, often unable to move, is just very open to cheese by concept. Cerulean Crescent's answer seems to be to just not try to have a single good boss duel, and instead just have a lot of bosses. Almost every map features multiple enemies with faces that make them look recruitable, with tiny little descriptions from the POV of the main character. You'll have no illusions that this isn't just a villain of the day or whatever, but it's still a level above the generic enemy, so I guess they somehow made quantity over quality work. That's as good of a bridge to the writing of this game as I'm ever gonna get. If you're going to remember anything I say about the writing, it should be this. The writer of Cerulean Crescent enjoys writing, and it really shows. It is a great example of a serious conflict written in a very humoristic tone. It is exactly the type of humor that I enjoy. It's kind of dry, it's part dark and part silly. The main character, as I've mentioned before, is Ellery, and she is absolutely not your standard Fire Emblem Lord. I think Ellery's personality and background is best discovered gradually as the game lets you do, so I'm not going to spoil all the twists with her, but this girl is, depending on what the situation calls for, ambitious, resourceful, clever, vengeful, ruthless, and at times manipulative. You can tell from her interactions with other characters and the way people talk about her that she absolutely has her own agenda and that people around her are not always on board with it. This creates conflict, it creates drama, there's always something brewing, and that makes conversations in this game interesting. Ellery is not the type of person I would want to be around, but I absolutely love reading her as a character, and she constantly makes me want to know what she's up to next. I've played a lot of games recently where the main character is so lacking in agency, in interesting reactions to the situations at hand, and it's so refreshing to have the polar opposite here. Ellery always has clear goals, known and unknown ones, and she constantly has to weigh her ambitions against her desire to keep her allies close. But whether she's doing that because she cares about them as allies or because she needs them for her goals is always a question that is at the forefront of the other characters' minds, as well as for the player. Now, while Ellery is the most important person for the story of Cerulean Crescent, it is also clear that the world does not revolve around her. Every place and every character has their own things going on. There is a seriously complicated interconnected web of politics on the Cerulean Crescent that takes nearly the entire game to fully grasp. I think a big mistake that a lot of Fire Emblem games make is they start the game off with that huge sum up of various nations and or leaders. It's just boring and impossible to keep track of, and I'm so glad that the writer didn't do that for Cerulean Crescent. Instead, each faction in each person and each nation is gradually introduced throughout in a natural way, and while you might not remember who is who and what is what immediately, their defining traits are instead brought up here and there again in a way that reinforces their traits so that you do eventually remember. Cerulean Crescent is just great in general at show, not tell. The exposition feels very natural. There's almost no fish out of water character to dump exposition on, so usually when characters talk to each other, they're going to stick to saying things the other doesn't already know. They don't start conversations with, "Cousin, as you know, when you were young, we did this and this and that, you were that and that and that." It's left up to other conversations and occasionally the player to fill in the blanks if there are any. I found it really easy to get a feel for who the characters are, their backgrounds, their personalities, even though the game doesn't have any support conversations. Instead, the characters often talk to each other in the explorations, and sometimes they have talk conversations on the battlefield, and a surprising number of characters have multiple appearances in the story itself. Not all of them, but it's a bigger group than in most mainline Fire Emblem games. One of my favorite ways this game adds characterization is through the item and character descriptions in the stat screens. As you play, you soon find out that they are from Ellery's point of view, and whenever that point of view changes, for example at one point to Oriana, the difference is reflected in changes to these descriptions. If you're familiar with my channel, then you know that story and character analysis is generally not my forte. Not fort. I'm someone who enjoys every first read-through of just about any story, but in the end, I am mostly here for the gameplay. Writing a story that is complex enough to be compelling, but not so complex that it's too hard to follow, while also making it entertaining enough to hold someone's attention, is brutally difficult, especially if you're just some person working on a passion project and not an entire team of game developers. Almost every line in Cerulean Crescent oozes passion and enjoyment. This was not a story made out of obligation, an afterthought that was decided upon after the gameplay. This is made by someone who enjoys the craft. I have just one critique of the writing, and I'm not even sure if it's a proper critique. It has to do with the final portion of the game. Now, I don't want to spoil this game for people, so I'm going to put it in vague terms. If you have yet to play this game and you want to do so unspoiled, I recommend you look away from the screen for a bit, because I do want to put footage of some sections that I'm talking about, just to make it clear what I'm talking about for people who have played. But if you don't want to get spoiled, I recommend you listen but don't look. So near the end of the game, some things happen that change the flow of the story based on some choices you have made and are about to make. One is about a decision you make really early on, and some others are branching paths that you can choose then and there. The entire outcome of the plot changes so much depending on your choices here, including one joking ending that I honestly found really funny. And I really want to say I applaud the efforts that went into including so many different branches and possibilities into the final section. Rivian didn't have to do that, but they did it anyway, I assume because they like creating things. But I do have two issues with this. One is a small one, which is that some of them are without warning to the player. Some of them are, and I appreciate those, but some of them are not. And that can cause you to have to replay some small bits again, just because you didn't know a choice was coming up. But that is more of a nitpick. The more important issue is maybe more of a personal one, so I'm curious what the comment section has to say about this, because I want to know if I'm the only one. When I'm nearing the end of a game like this, I get hyped up, maybe even a bit anxious. I want to see how it ends. There are a bunch of loose ends, and I just want to know how they get tied up. I get in a bit of a rush. I'll still take my time to read everything, but I might be a bit more willing to look into, say, using warp to my advantage to speed up the gameplay. I'll patiently go through the first 20-ish maps, but the closer I am to what I believe to be the end of the game, the more badly I want to get to the end of the game. So while I'm in the rush to get to this conclusion, suddenly I have to make choices to determine what that conclusion is, and depending on what I choose, the ending changes. Me personally, I'm a bigger fan of one solid narrative with one canonical conclusion. I want to see not a possible ending or multiple possible endings, but the ending. A story has a bigger impact on me if it follows one thread instead of branching out. And the other problem I have with this is that it slows down the pace, which is tough for me to handle when I'm in that rush. In my head, we are inches away from seeing the ending, but then it turns out there's a bunch of branching paths, and now we're not inches but miles away. And I can't be that excited for the finale for miles. Having said all that, Cerulean Crescent does not have a bad aftertaste. The final confrontation is still good. And because the characters and their inner conflicts have been set up so well, all possible choices that can be made are completely understandable, nobody acts out of character, even the endings that are clearly not the true ending. The absolute final battle had a real emotional impact on me, despite all the things I just said. It was a fitting conclusion for all the characters involved. And that, I suppose, is a fitting conclusion for this review. If you want to try the game out, and you should, the link is down below. Enjoy. I know I did.